Canada's former Deputy Minister of International Trade, joins us in studio to weigh in on how Canada should be preparing for NAFTA negotiations. Don Campbell supervised the initial negotiation of NAFTA. He has also served as Canada's Deputy Foreign Minister, as Canada's Ambassador to Japan and to Korea. He is the International Co-Chair of the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council, and he's based in Vancouver as a Senior Strategy Advisor for DLA Piper. Don, thank you very much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
From your view, and you have quite a lot of experience in this area, how well has the Canadian government responded to the Trump administration's threats and promises around NAFTA?
Well, I think generally the Canadian government has responded quite well. It's been a very difficult situation because on the U.S. side of the border, everything is totally unpredictable. So Canada needs to be, first of all, defensive, and secondly, have its game plan in play. And I think that I've been quite impressed, I must say, by the general approach that has been taken by the Canadian government to Canada-U.S. relations. And I think we're going to go through, as I said, an unpredictable period, but one of the most difficult periods in that relationship in a long, long time.
How cozy or not should Canada be at this stage, do you think, Don?
Well, that's a good question. I think every government, and I've been around for quite a while, every government is faced with that issue. And they never get it quite right. Either the Canadian public think that they're too cozy, or they think that they're too distant. So I think there needs to be good personal rapport. I'm a fan of relationships, and I think that when you go back over history and you look at relationships starting at the top, that relationship is important. And I think that it appears as though Prime Minister Trudeau has developed a relationship with President Trump. I think there's been an all-out assault on the part of federally primarily, but also provincially, all-out assault on the decision makers in Washington. And I think, and I'm not talking about in substance as much as in terms of relationships. And I think that's going to be an important step in terms of when we get down to the hard issues.
To what extent is it to Canada's benefit to work with the U.S. on really coming to a quick resolution to NAFTA? The U.S. has made it clear they'd like to see something maybe December, January 2018.
Well, it depends. It depends what the U.S. negotiating position is going to be. If the U.S. Leadership thinks that you're going to have a totally overhauled NAFTA and have it by the end of the year, I think they're dreaming in Technicolor. This is a difficult process. If you're not worried as much about substance, and you're looking for a quote win, and I think that's the way that Mr. Trump approaches things, you could do it in a shorter period of time. But you're starting to see now the whole weight of the U.S. business community, starting to see the Canadian business community, the various elements of the U.S. administration, states, governors. As all of these things come into play, it'll prove how complex this is. One of the real ironies of this negotiation is that Canada was, if I do say so, a laggard in terms of joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership talks, the TPP, the famous TPP talks. And when we did join, I think there were a couple of reasons. One was that we wanted to protect our position with our two major trading partners, Mexico and the United States, and we already had the NAFTA. The second, there really were three main elements. The second one was we wanted to change NAFTA. It needed renovation. This is an agreement that was completed in 1993, 1994.
There was no internet then.
No, there was no internet then. There was no e-commerce then.
Yeah.
No digital economy. There was a totally different world. So a lot of things needed to change. So but we knew because the NAFTA has been a dirty word in the United States for a long time. I think politicians have used the NAFTA as the beating boy or girl for every single ailment that has ever afflicted any U.S. state or any portion of industry, and in my view, quite unfairly. So we'd, I think, come to the conclusion collectively that the only way you're going to get a renovated NAFTA is through the TPP. The third reason, which is important, is that we have been unable to come to a bilateral agreement ever with Japan. And Japan is another important player. And they were in the TPP talks. So those were the three objectives I think we had. The irony that we have now, of course, with the U.S. Withdrawing from the TPP, is I am sure, are going to see a number of the chapters of the TPP brought back into the NAFTA negotiations by our American friends. And we're not necessarily opposed to this, but this thing has come full circle back to a NAFTA negotiation, which is probably where we wanted to be to start with. It may have been a different negotiation. It may be a different negotiation, but we've come full circle.
I think as Canadians, we have this deferential position to the rest of the world. We consider ourselves to be small. The United States is so large, and, it's like the Trudeau analogy of sleeping next to the elephant kind of thing. We don't want to wake that elephant up. But can Canada actually benefit from having itself at the table this time around on a new NAFTA negotiation, perhaps adopting some of the TPP measures that may not now be implemented with the United States as part of it?
Having been at a number of these tables, and I don't want to sound boastful, I don't think when we get to the table there is any intimidation. We're really among equals at that table. And we, quite frankly, traditionally and today, have a significant advantage. We have a top team of very experienced trade negotiators. And every time you come up with the Americans, you're dealing with people who've been in government, out of government, and often are not as familiar with the sets of issues as we are.
So would they be the inexperienced ones at the table, more or less?
They'll be the inexperienced ones at the table. Now, obviously, you've got American power, which will be pushed to the hilt in all of this. But we will not be forced to agree to positions that are inimical to our interest, and the Mexicans, in their own way, I don't think will be either. So this will be a tough negotiation, obviously with a very large partner. But when you get to the table, I don't think that's
and yet just to follow up on that though, Don. I mean, it has been predicated in the past on having a president who actually is somewhat predictable. This is a president, I think you would agree, who knows what he thinks tweet to tweet, right? So how do you kind of sail forward on this one properly, knowing that the guy at the top may get these pieces of paper in front of him and just tear him up almost when he sees it? Well,
in the best of circumstances, he will, and we can't guarantee this. He will rely on. There are some good people in the administration who are around him. He's got some experienced people from the business community. His U.S. Trade Representative Lighthizer is an experienced trade lawyer.
Yeah,
I mean, it's rather ironic that he actually represented China in the steel negotiations.
I don't think the president's found that out yet. By the way,
that's what trade lawyers do.
Yeah,
they're as good as their last client. So I mean, there's a lot of expertise, and you're now starting to see, and I'm very encouraged by this. Just this week, we've had the Business Council of Canada and the U.S. Roundtable and their Mexican counterpart. They all met in Washington the day before yesterday. Separately, a couple of days before that, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and their Mexican counterparts met. So the industries in all of these countries are now finally starting to make themselves heard as institutions, and they will have an effect. I think they certainly had an effect on the president when he first threatened to withdraw from the NAFTA rather than renegotiate the NAFTA. Now, they will have everyone has their own agenda. They will have tough issues that they'll wish to address. But I think that we're finding the both large and small industry in United States, Canada, and Mexico is now very alive to the sets of issues and is going to make its voice heard. What effect that at the end of the day will have on Mr. Trump remains to be seen. And one of the real worries that you have today is, as you have said, at the end of the day, there will be issues that go right to the top. There certainly were in the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. There were in the NAFTA negotiations when you come to an impasse. And the U.S. administration has always operated as a group of fiefdoms. U.S. cabinet members do not have the solidarity that you find in a Canadian cabinet. They're all playing their own games. And the National Security Council and the White House have always played the refereeing role at the end of the day in this. And I'm not sure exactly how that is going to come in this negotiation. And that is, I think, a significant worry.
There have been a number of sectors that have been called out specifically: the automobile sector, softwood lumber, energy, dairy. Do you know at this stage what might be prioritized by the Canadian government if push comes to shove?
Well, certainly the Canadian government will, first of all, as a priority, want to maintain the body and the framework of the current agreement. We'll start from there. We do not want to get into a renegotiation of tariffs. Rules of origin is another very difficult area. You can tweak that around the edges, and that leads you particularly right into the automotive industry, where Mr. Trump, in some of his more outlandish comments, has talked about 30% tariffs and that kind of thing. So certainly, I would think that the Canadian position, to which I'm not privy, will be to maintain, and that's what industry is saying as well. You've got to maintain the integrated supply chains. The North American flows of things that are going across the border in the way that they are going. You've got to maintain all of that, and then you've got to improve that. Certainly agriculture, which has always been a special case in every trade negotiation, not just for Canada but for everybody else, will be very difficult, and they will come after us on supply management. I don't happen to be a fan of supply management. I think that Canada should be one of the world's largest exporters of dairy products. Instead, we don't export. We export very little.
It may have cost Maxime Bernier the leadership of the Conservative Party. Yeah, that's how Canada is.
It's a politically very difficult. But I think even in the dairy industry, there are those who are left. I mean, we've gone from in 1980 there were 140,000 dairy farmers. Today there are 11,000. They're all big businesses, and they're getting around it. You get a company like Saputo, for example. They're buying cheese companies in New Zealand, Australia, and the United States. They're fine in the world market, but it's not helping the Canadian dairy industry in any way, shape, or form. So that's going to be a difficult issue. And there are issues on the U.S. side in dairy as well. Softwood lumber, and I'm a former chief negotiator for softwood lumber a long time ago, has always been the very difficult one. We didn't deal with it satisfactorily in the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement or the NAFTA originally. And that one comes around, we're now at number 5, I think, in terms of that. That issue, it tends to get tied into the Trump administration, but it actually started before that. The U.S. industry, as soon as Canada gets over 30% penetration in the U.S. Market, the U.S. Coalition for Softwood Lumber, which is a very powerful lobby, and for which, in my view, the U.S. government has usually just acted as the post office, is at it again. As long as we have 90% of our forests in Crown lands or in public ownership, and they have 90% in private ownership, the systems are different, and we're going to end up having these issues. The irony is there will be suffering in Canada, but there'll be even more suffering in the U.S. in terms of the consumer. Because at the end of the day, the consumer is going to carry the freight in terms of increased prices for softwood lumber. And unfortunately, the U.S. coalition, even if it loses eventually, which it always has done at the end of the day, it still wins because during that period, prices have gone up and things have changed. So it's a perennial issue for us, and it won't go away. And the NAFTA negotiation will not solve the new NAFTA negotiation will not solve that.
As we know, in the U.S., they're going through their consultation period right now. Should that be happening in Canada to a greater extent than it is?
It actually is happening in Canada. It's not happening in as visible a way as I would like it to, as I would like to see it. the Department of Global Affairs, which we now call the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade. Sounds a little bit like a PR firm to me, but in any event, they have called for consultation. So industry is now gearing up. Individuals, consumers, anybody has a right now during this period to do that. I don't think it's got as much visibility as it should have. I think it's unfortunate that the Canadian private sector is not as organized as it has been in the past. If I go way back into history, when we did the Canada-U.S. free trade negotiations, we set up a very formal process. We had something called ITAC, the Industry Trade Advisory Committee, that had the private sector. When I say the private sector, it had unions, it had academics, and it had leaders from all sectors of industry. We then had 22 SAGITs, sectoral advisory groups on international trade. And that process went on for about 4 years. And during that process, there were over 1,000 CEOs in Canada who were directly involved in discussions and meeting and recommendations. There's nothing as organized as that this time around. And you don't see as much visibility. Although, as I said, I was very pleased to see that both the Business Council of Canada and the Canadian Chamber of Commerce in Washington with their counterparts.
I don't know whether you have an individual in mind, Don. I mean, you could easily be one of the negotiators, the chief negotiator for Canada at this next round of NAFTA. But, we have a pretty formidable guy in Simon Reisman in this case with you in this last round. Is there an individual who's out there in the country who could take this one on?
I think they have named their chief negotiator. It's a guy by the name of Steve Verhull, who's a career diplomat, very highly regarded, very much involved in the Canada-EU negotiations. So I think that we're going to be well served by our negotiators. Provinces have started naming people for specific issues. Softwood lumber, for example. You've got David Emerson from BC. You've got Jim Peterson from Ontario. You've got Raymond Chrétien from Quebec. So I think you're going to find, and this is going to be an interesting negotiation because we've come around to a lot more involvement and participation of provinces than we have in the past. And that's got a very positive aspect, but it has a fairly difficult management aspect as well. But we got through that with the Canada-EU free trade agreement. So I don't think that you're going to see a quote Simon Reisman type name, but I'm not sure. I'm quite sure that the team that's assembled in Ottawa will be very capable of doing it. And I think you'll also find, this is also both good and negative, that in the case of the NAFTA, ministers were very much involved personally. Michael Wilson for Canada, Carla Hills this is the original NAFTA for the United States, and Jaime Serra for Mexico. So I think you're going to get a lot of ministerial involvement.
So Chrysler Freeland, Wilbur Ross, those types.
Those teams will be very heavily involved in this process. Yeah, whether ministers are good negotiators, I'll leave that to
whole other discussion. Yeah, exactly.
Don, it's been great to have you on the show. Thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
That's Don Campbell. He's Canada's former Deputy Minister of International Trade at the table during NAFTA's original negotiation. He's also a senior strategy advisor with DLA Piper.